Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum student. This is Umaira Said, lecturer Times Institute, Multan, and I am going to deal with the subject of business communication today, and we are going to study communication types and the models. So before going into the depth and plunged into what is communication, what are the types and the models of communication, today we are discuss first that what is the formula of success. Most of the students generally ask me, the teacher, how we can make our life more successful, how can we be more successful in the regular life. So I used to convey to my students that be the ATM. How you can become an ATM machine? It is not necessary for you to become an ATM machine, but you can follow the ATM model of life to be successful in your career. What is ATM? A stand for give an attention, T stand for all the tools and the techniques which you can use to grab the attention of the people, and number 3 is the mass market. Now the issue is that how you can get the attention of the people by using all the tools and the techniques to grab the market, and this is the only formula to be successful in your life. Now moving into the topic, and that is the communication. My dear students, there is no particular definition of the communication, and I cannot, like in the shortest possible words, I cannot compose a single definition of communication. If I move to the origin of communication, the communication has its origin back in the Latin, and it derived from the word communis, which means to share. What to share? The sharing of ideas, thoughts, knowledge. Aristotle says that communication is a mode to persuade others to get the desired results. So it means that communication is a two-way process. If I am speaking and you listening on the other side of the screen, if you are giving me the feedback, then the communication will be continued. So communication is not a one-way process, it is a two-way process. If I am communicating to you, you are giving me the feedback, so this circle continues. So basically the communication is the impart of ideas from one person to another person, from one place to another place. If I move to the primitive idea of the communication, like 500 million years ago, the single mode of communication was the noise and the gestures. Like humans used to communicate with each other by producing some particular sounds, some gestures, and that correlates with the animal communication. The animals usually communicate with their particular signals, with the sounds. It has been said that when the animals are in danger, they produce the sounds which can only be recognized by their fellow animals. So that's how the animal communication entirely differentiates from the human communication. There were also another modes of communication, like in the primitive ages, the people used to beat the drum to communicate and disseminate their message to their fellow beings. Now coming to the types of communication. There are multiple types of communication. I hope that every one of you would have the pen and the pencil in your hand so that we may write all the types of communication. Now write it down: the verbal communication, the non-verbal communication, formal, informal, interpersonal, intrapersonal, extrapersonal. Verbal communication. Verbal communication is the oral communication. As you say that whatever in your regular life, when you speak, it is the verbal and the oral communication, and it is being said that the 25% of our daily life we spend in communicating. Now the non-verbal communication. Basically the non-verbal communication is very vast, but let me shorten it for you, that sometimes when the words are not used, that is said to be the non-verbal communication. So let me explain you in a more possible words, like the sounds and the gestures, your postures. You know, when you are driving on the road, the signboards on the sides of the roads, these are also the form of non-verbal communication. The signboards never speaks, but you understand that what they are saying. Secondly, the color speaks as well. You know, every color has its own meaning. The color yellow is a sign of so sparkling, and the glory, whereas the red is the symbol of horror, whereas the green is the symbol of soothing. So the color has its own reflections as well. Non-verbal communication also deals with the silence, time and the space. The formal communication. The formal, as the word says, that the communication in which the formal sentences are used, the words and the vocabulary are used, you behave so formally while communicating with your bosses, with the principal, with the teachers or some respectable persons in your family. The informal communication which is very informal, the way you communicate with your friends and the family and sometimes with your most chums, and that is said to be the informal communication. Interpersonal communication. The communication between the two persons is said to be the interpersonal communication. Like if you are communicating between you and your friend, that is the interpersonal communication. What is intrapersonal communication? As Shakespeare said it to the soliloquies, like when you speaking to yourself, unfolding ideas to yourself, that executing the plan and making the plan in your mind, that is said to be the intrapersonal communication. Extrapersonal communication. Extrapersonal communication, like when you have developed some nostalgic memories, you have developed some association. Nowadays due to the pandemic you are staying at your home, but when you pass by the building of your institute, you develop some kind of an association. You just go back to the nostalgia, oh my institute, I used to spend a very good time here. It means that this is the extrapersonal communication. The building never responds you, but you develop an association. That is the extrapersonal communication. Now moving to the model of communication. The model of communication is very simple. As I told you that communication is a two-way process. There is a sender and the receiver. There must be the message that is composed by the sender, received by the receiver. After receiving the message, when the receiver understands that message and compose another message and give response to the sender, it is said to be the feedback. And that's how the communication circles completed. While the communication model, like while communicating, there are so many barriers you have to face. There are so many channels through which you can convey your media. Nowadays there are so many social platforms, radio, television, films. These are all the modes of communication. These are all the channels through which you may communicate and through which you may disseminate and send your message. You know, there are so many billboards, there are so many hoardings. So sometimes it is a Chinese proverb that a picture speaks louder than the words. It means that when you see a picture, a static picture, it also speaks for you. The barriers in the communication are, there are multiple barriers, students. There are so many barriers, but most important which I have been written here is the gender barrier, the cultural barrier, the lingual barrier, the environmental barrier and the religious barrier. Gender barrier in our society, the females and the males are so hesitant while talking to each other. So sometimes they do not understand, or sometimes they feel shy, or sometimes they cannot communicate the way they want to communicate to them. So this is the gender barrier. The second is the cultural barrier. In our culture there are so many restrictions as well. So we have an old perceptions, the way we think is entirely different from the people from another culture. That is called the cultural barrier. Linguistic barrier or the lingual barrier. Due to the poor knowledge, due to the poor vocabulary, the weaker sentence construction and the sentences is the reason of the lingual barrier, and sometimes we are not habitual of speaking the English more frequently, and sometimes the people who are adapted to understand some languages like Punjabi, Israeli or some like Persian, so they do not prefer to speak in the English. So these are the linguistic barrier, and you know, sometimes we cannot speak to the child the way we speak to the adult person. So this is the linguistic barriers which may deterrent in our communicating to other person. Environmental barrier. Suppose I am talking to you, and if I am talking to you and there is a lot of knocking of the door and the slamming of the door and someone start drilling outside the room, so it will become the environmental barriers, and these environmental barriers sometimes become the obstacle of delivering the message from one person to another person. The religious barrier. So this is one of the most touchy topic, and the religious, sometimes we cannot completely communicate to the person who have a different ideologies with their own religious sects. So it may become a very important barrier in communicating from one person to another person. So my dear students, since first the communication types and the models, inshallah ta'ala, the next lecture will be about the non-verbal communication in detail, and we will discuss. Thank you so much.